welcome back to my channel, and in this particular series we're carrying on with reviewing older role-playing games and other games, and as we go on, hopefully discussing and making people's minds up with whether these games are worth resurrecting for them, especially now that a lot of them are available either on print on demand or as PDFs through places like RPG. In this particular one, we're going to be covering the next edition of a game that we've already covered. In this one, we're going to be covering the Rolemaster Standard System, which was ultimately repackaged and represented as the Rolemaster Fantasy Role-Playing System. They're essentially the same game, just packaged up in different books and so on. So for the early part of Rolemaster's history, up to around about 1994, then I urge you to go and have a look back at my Rolemaster 2nd edition / Rolemaster Classic video that takes Rolemaster all the way from its inception in the 1980 all the way through to the publication of Rolemaster Standard System in 1994. So we pick up our story here of Iron Crown Enterprises and Rolemaster in 1994. So by that time, the Rolemaster system had comprised a set of core books plus numerous supplements for various genres and so on, and campaign settings and a number of companions, and it was quite a vast array of books for if you're a completist and you got the entire game. The game was now 14 years old at that point, and as is normal within the role-playing game industry, a new edition of games, as new concepts are introduced, as the material expands and so on, new editions aren't that rare. We're in the 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons. We're in the 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons, but it's actually something like the 7th or 8th edition of that game that's been floating around. RuneQuest, somewhere around about 7 or 8, although that's got a bit muddied. Traveller, 5th / probably 27th edition with all the variants and so on. So a new edition of a game is not that surprising within the role-playing game genre. So it's quite normal for a role-playing game to go through a period of growth, and then for the publisher to set back, see what's come before, take the best ideas of what's come before, reformulate, repackage, rethink, and put out a new edition. And so this is what Iron Crown Enterprises did in 1994. So the goal was to take the best of what had come prior. So that included all of the companions and that had been released for 2nd edition of Rolemaster, and put them into a more balanced framework. If anyone's actually played 2nd edition with the whole kitchen sink thrown in, they probably knew that all of that big boiling pot of mix could produce a very, very broken game. So RMSS was sort of like a reset button for all of that, to try and consolidate the best of what had come, the best of the Rolemaster, the 2nd edition rules and supplements and so on, and put them into a framework where they all worked happily together. So the relatively small number of core skills from the Rolemaster 2nd edition game had gone through several revisions, not least in the 2nd and 3rd companions, and that kind of exploded everything out. So one of the goals here was to take that large number of skills and reorganize them in such a way as would make them more accessible and make a bit more sense than just this huge list of skills that 2nd edition brought in. So one of the things that Rolemaster Companion 2 brought in was this concept of similar skills. So bonus in one particular skill would give you an additional bonus to another skill. So they were all related. So instead of doing that within RMSS, what they came up with the concept of skill categories. So it rejigged everything, a skill belonged to a skill category. You didn't just develop the skill, you also developed a percentage in the skill category, and the two added together gave you that bonus for a particular skill, which also meant that skill category bonus provided that similar skill framework where skills of a particular sort or a particular nature already carried a bonus, and then you specialised further by getting the skills. Now that idea of developing skill in categories allowed characters to be generalised and specialised at the same time. I'll try and explain this. Because Rolemaster 2, the second edition, started off with a finite number of skills, small number of skills, that in a way mimicked the class abilities from Dungeons and Dragons and games that had gone before it. And that was the sort of the framework in which it was built. That was the expected thing. These were the core abilities of classes. There were some optional skills that you could build in there to round characters out, but that was sort of it. With the explosion of skills through the companions, you could end up, if you tried to go and scatter your skill points near and far, you would end up a character that wasn't really particularly good at anything. If you specialised, and I think magicians and things like that really did have to specialise in order to become any good at casting spells, and with the selection of spells and so on that was useful, then you would end up with a character that was so narrowly defined, it sort of made a mockery of the whole idea of having this open skill system as well. So by reformulating them and putting them into categories in which you could develop ranks, that allowed characters to become generalised without being too specific in things. So you could specialise in a few skills, and that would give you your main focus of your character. But by doing so, you'd also develop a skill in the category areas, which meant that you could still have that generalised level to your character. The character would know a little bit about a lot of things at the category level, and then a lot about a few things at the skill level. And I think that was a good way of reorganising things so they worked and didn't become too diluted for the sheer number of skills that were introduced into the game. Another good change was a finer definition of race and culture. In second edition, race and culture defined certain things like hit dice and certain resistance roll saves and some characteristic bonuses, stat bonuses. That was expanded out into in RMSS. So what you had in RMSS was not only those bonuses, they're still there, but you also had certain skills that were identified as being easier for particular races and cultures to pick up, and they became these everyman skills by race and culture. So that made skill choice a factor of both your race and culture selection and your profession selection. So that was another way that a character's base could be broadened out. Things like the diminishing returns you got by skill rank for things like spell points, for hit points from body development and so on. In terms of spell points and so on, spell point development became, or power points, and power point development became core to the game rather than an optional. Those also, not the skills themselves, although they could belong to the everyman categories, but the actual progression that they took, number of points that you gained per skill rank, that was a diminishing return across. So the more skill ranks you developed, the fewer points per rank that you actually gained. It stopped people from being superhuman and so on. I've gone over that before, but this was now, instead of being defined by the type of spell user you were, or by a fixed value, a fixed amount for the body development skill, the PowerPoint development was determined by your profession. So a pure profession would have a pure spellcaster would have a higher rate of return and whatever. So these were set by race and culture now. So so it meant you could have you could build into the race a greater affinity for a particular sort of magic, be it channeling or essence or mentalism. You could build that in, so that would also affect your profession choice. So I think it was good because this defines the races and cultures. I think there's been a move in recent sort of role-playing games to try and remove those boundaries of race and culture, particularly race. And if you've seen any of my videos on RuneQuest especially, you'll see I don't really favour the term race. I prefer species. Race being a term that is sort of has connotations in the real world that are quite unstable ground, whereas species definitively says that this is different from that. A dwarf is as different from a human as a cat is from a dog. So stops that homogenizing of things where effectively what you've got is a whole bunch of humans that just look different from each other. And I don't think that works very well in my mind about in the definition of things. But where you've got things like in RMSS where a lot of the definition of the direction in which a character can become good because of affinity and nature of the species, let's say species, and that can also be shaped by culture as well. So you have on top of that the cultural differences, whether someone, particularly amongst humans, where you've got urban humans, you've got rural humans, you've got hill folk and whatever. They've all got different life experiences, and you can build that into the description of the race themselves that has direct connotations onto their game characteristics, particularly shaping their profession choice, and also shaping the way that their profession choice will ultimately develop, or the direction in which they will develop most efficiently. So it does sound like a bit like a min-max's wet dream, and to a certain extent it is, picking and choosing the best combinations for various things in a game that is so numerical and so statistical like Rolemaster is. It does tie into the idea of or the realm of the min-maxer as they piece everything together and figure out the numbers and what the best route to go in. It does do that, but it also allows you to create well-defined, rounded characters and build them more or less. Rather than being a system that is so undefined as to characters are virtually shapeless in the statistical sense, and everything has to come from narrative. With Rolemaster, and very specifically with RMSS and RMFRP, the characters' choices, the nature of the characters, does give them a very good, strong framework in which to develop in a statistical way. So you won't get a dwarf. A dwarf fighter in RMSS will be much more well defined as a dwarf fighter than a Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition dwarf fighter. It just the way that the systems are structured. Adding into that, the way that background options work is also greatly expanded in this in RMSS. In the core rules as well, there was an additional supplement called Talent Law that really blew the whole background thing open to all sorts of different directions that you could take it. But the core rules expanded it out a lot from 2nd edition as well. So all in all, the idea of that set up to do with RMSS was to provide players with a greatly expanded canvas on which to build their characters through the rules, and in a more coherent and balanced way than taking all of the companions as a kitchen sink from 2nd edition and potentially breaking the game or coming up with some things that don't quite work well together. Once Iron Crown had got this all figured out and laid down some draft rules, they took it around and playtested the heck out of it. They did a lot of playtesting at conventions, And I think it probably worked out that RMSS was more play tested than any previous first or second edition version of Rolemaster. That also plays out because a lot of the concepts were already out there in second edition. They were just trying to codify it and tweak it so that they all work together. So from that sense, the things that ended up in RMSS, what was really being play tested was the way in which those rules interacted rather than the specifics of the rules themselves. So after the playtesting, the first release of the new version followed the same pattern as they had with previous versions. So Arms Law came first. That was released in 1994. One of the major selling points, I think, and it certainly helped us out, of the RMSS version of Arms Law was that you had you had the attack tables, sure, with dagger and so on. I'll show you it in action. Oh. So one of the key features of the RMS version of Arms Law was the fact that you had your attack tables, but you also, as you can see there, you also had the critical tables printed on the reverse side. So there's the attack table for the Morning Star, and on the back you've got the two critical tables that require that Morning Star attack refers to. So and these sheets were all perforated. The whole of the RMSS line, or a good chunk of it, at least in the core rules, was 3-hole punched, and the pages perforated. So you could sort of remove them and put them in any order you like. Personally, I kept them all together. And this goes through the same. You've got the whatever one that is, natural attacks, and again with the critical tables on the back. So and the critical tables are printed separately at the back of the book as well. It does make the book about twice as thick or more than the second edition Arms Law, but it does make it a lot more user friendly. If you've got that one sheet in front of you and you've got your criticals directly on the side of it, it just cuts down the paperwork, and it also makes the book easier to read. Just go, okay, I've got my weapon table. I only have to flick over one page to get to the criticals for it. So that was a selling point even for users of players of second edition with the old version of Arms Law. So I'm running around on the roof. So Arms Law was released in 94, and then following on from that in 95, you got Spell Law, again massively thicker than the original, but again with the spell attack tables. It did similar things. So you've got the attack table, and then you've got the relevant critical tables on the back. So so part of it is from that aspect of it. And another thing, the spell lists are nicely formulated as well. Some of the spells to fill in the spell lists that were released in the companions also made it into Spell Law. So the spell lists in here are more complete than the spell lists from second edition. You also, this version, I guess the RMSS version of Character Law and Campaign Law, and in the actual Rolemaster standard rules themselves, and there's pretty much everything in there. You've got all the tables at the back. You've got training packages. We'll come into that in the play section. All of the classes and cultures and races and so on are in their own section. All of the skills, there you can see these, the way they're category, and then a specific resolution table for the category, and a bunch of skills that are included in the category. So that's pretty much how they all go for 1 page per category in there. You've got each class now. In second edition you had a little box about that big, but now the class takes up, a profession, sorry, takes up a whole page, as does your races and cultures. So there you go, your races and cultures also take up a whole page. And this is what I was saying earlier about the various progressions that you've got for PowerPoint development and body development and so on. So pretty much everything that you need for your particular race is on 1 page. Again, hole punched. Again, all the pages are perforated so you can put them in any shape or form that you like. There some, I don't know, again, this is one of the things that Iron Crown have difficulty with, is trying to put the things in. I mean, okay, you're about the thickness of arms law in, or the original second edition arms law in, before it starts getting into actually putting your character together. First bit of it is general concepts and things like that, which well, your mileage for error is, it is, you know, it starts off by describing everything about it and then goes into showing you how to generate a character, which I think would have been better in a more hand-holdy way. Now in your character generation process you need to do this, and these are what the things mean. Plus, if you consider that's where you're designing your character, and then all the way back here is where you're actually referencing race and things. So the book's a bit all over the place. Like I said, this is RMSS. The Rolemaster Fantasy Role-Playing books did do a better job of splitting things up like that. And the monster book, obviously, creatures and monsters also floating around. But I think one of the most fascinating books that RMSS came out with, or in that particular line, was Games Master Lore. Now, if you are a fantasy role-playing game master, you need a copy of this, regardless of what game system you're actually using. I mean, a lot of it is, yes, very role-mastery, but most of it is just really good information about, you know, playing, setting up campaigns, what sort of things you should really consider. There's a sort of, you know, this building cultures, putting kingdoms together, what a game should really be like, you're designing campaigns. All of this is really good advice from some really experienced referees. So I can, whatever game system you're playing, that book, you know, one day when I start getting into maybe reviewing individual products, I would love to tear this book apart for you and just show you some of the wonders therein. But it's a good book. Whatever game system you're playing, it's a good book. Almost on par with first edition Dungeon Master's Guide. I think the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide and that book, Games Master Lore, are probably two of the best how to be a role-playing game referee and set up a campaign books that you can ever come across. I think it's one of the things that's lacking in a lot of games. Oh, maybe the 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide as well. That does quite a good job. And the 3rd edition one. Yeah, it is often something that's really lacking from games, and those 2 volumes are pretty good. One of the things they also did, they came up with this. Oh, don't get this out much. I reckon that shelf isn't going to die as well, right? The basic set. Now this is a quick thing. There you go. 1 rule book. That's the sort of that's the equivalent to the standard rules volume, and then you've got, that's the equivalent to the table bit and other half of the standard rules. That's sort of arms law, and then you've got 3 thin books here, which you know, one's channeling, one essence, and one mentalism. magic book. So it really is a cut down version of the full game, and I think it's very good if it's your first rodeo with Rolemaster. I think it's a very good set. But I think if you're moving to RMSS, having played second edition Rolemaster, a lot of the stuff will be familiar to you, and I don't think the basics was particularly useful. I'm kind of glad I did pick it up, because it gave it was an easier tool to teach the game using. You suddenly sort of throw this chunk of rule books, which is about twice as thick as the box set at the basic rules box set, at a new player, and watch their brain melt. Whereas that was an easier in. Limits down the races and the professions and so on, but and it glosses over some of the more complex aspects of the full-blown Rolemaster rules. But certainly for a simple teaching the basics of it and getting used to all of the nuances and funny tables that Rolemaster loves. The game was then further expanded in '96 with the Arcane Companion, which was drawn from the concepts of Arcane, the combination of all types of magic, realm of magic, that was introduced in the companions in Rolemaster 2nd edition. Just bringing that into the RMSS realm. The Treasure Companion, which was more or less the alchemical companion from 2nd edition, again brought into the RMSS sphere, tidied up and so on. It's got the in 2nd edition you had Creatures and Treasures. Now you've got Creatures and Monsters as a separate book. So the Treasure Companion is a combination of the Treasures part of Creatures and Treasures line, plus elements of crafting magic items and so on that were in the alchemical, the Alchemy Companion from 2nd edition. And another book up here that I think is really good for everyone. This particular thing, as you can see, heavily bookmarked. And I refer back to this. I don't play Rolemaster standard system very much at all these days, but I still refer to a lot of its books because they're just so well done, so packed with stuff. This book goes into actually building castles and construction costs and useful spells for building them, and you know, catalogue of different bits of castle part and so. Really handy book, again compatible with virtually any role-playing game system that you would care to come across. So again, like the Game Master Companion, another one recommended whatever game you're playing. Talent Law, another book, but pretty much very much shouldn't need to grab them all off the shelf really. There's just showing them, but the idea behind Talent Law was it just listed page upon page upon page of here's the part of the table of contents, if you like. Yeah, carries on. Different background options and character options that you can build in for your talent point costs. But one of the really useful things in this, especially if you're like me, do homebrew campaigns more than any other type of playing, rather than published games, or even if you want to pick up cultures and races and whatnot from other games and convert them over to Rolemaster in some way, there is a really good system at the back. Here you go, this race generation system. So the idea there is you use the talent pick system to come up and you know, sort of pick and choose. Yes, they'll have that. Yes, they'll have that. Yes, they'll have that, and work out how much they cost. And the core races are all statted out for you in terms of their cost, just to act as examples and so on. So I mean, it's useful taking one of these and modifying it to your own campaign setting, or whichever way you want to do it. So really useful book, not in the same vein as Castles and Ruins and Games Master Lore, in the fact that it is quite role mastery, so doesn't really translate so much into other game systems, but it's as far as the RMSS and RMFRP goes, I would say that that's a definite must to have. Oh, and one last book that that was kicked out in '96, really early on, was the Underground Races. It just provided some more playable character races and some nuances there, background options and so on, that's specific. Mainly focused on things like orcs and goblins and no, I will get it down. So you basically got things like, you know, there's orcs and there's there you go, gnolls, and then some specific things that, you know, training packages and so on for specific to those. So it's I think it's more sort of dungeony if you really wanted to build in and go through, build up the non-humans. There's dwarves, gnolls, gnomes, goblins, halflings, hobgoblins, kobolds, orcs of various types, troglodytes. I can't say we use that book much at all, but mileage varies. I've never got rid of it, so I must have had some use out of it. So further options came out in '97 and '98, expanding on spell lore. So some companions were released for channeling, for mentalism and for essence. And in 1999, ICE kind of returned to the concept of things being, producing things that are a bit generic. Castles and Ruins and Games Master aside, I mean, they've got Rolemaster rules in them and things like, you know, training packages and stuff like that are very much a part of the Rolemaster game. I think it's by possibly more by accident than design that they happen to be really good non-Rolemaster books as well. But certainly when if you consider the root of Rolemaster was originally as generic supplements that could be built into any role-playing game, possibly expanding the complexity and detail out of those games, then, or the 1997 books and a 10-foot pole, which was an equipment book that can be applied to virtually any role-playing game, and 10 Million Ways to Die, which was another sort of plug and play book, more about sort of combat and various ways of injuring people. So those books were generic and, like the original Rolemaster books, could be built into any system that you wanted. They were also useful for Rolemaster. And then genre books. They started to produce genre books that would stretch out Rolemaster beyond its sort of normal sort of medieval fantasy role. The second edition started doing a little bit of that in some of the later supplements, where they started introducing different types of profession, like, you know, a space fantasy hero profession and so on, and certainly using the Rolemaster base rules to produce games such as Space Master. But what they were doing here was, rather than sort of redoing Space Master and stuff like that, they were trying this out to use Rolemaster as the core rules. You go out and have the standard rule book, the standard rules system, and then on top of that you would have genre books or campaign books or whatever that would deal with the specifics of a campaign setting, or modify the rules accordingly, or whatever. Sort of a similar way to the way that that Chaosium does with BRP. So it has BRP from which spring RuneQuest and Call of Cthulhu and so on. So with this, Rolemaster standard rules, and then genre books and setting books and so on build on top of that to send the game off in different directions. So Black Ops came out in 1997. That was a modern gaming on secret military units going in and performing missions. Firearms was another book that introduced statistics and combat tables for guns for all sorts of periods. Shades of Darkness is a post-apocalyptic fantasy vision of Earth. Pulp Adventures, in the sort of early 20th century type, westerns and spy thrillers and all of that. A lot of different subgenres all packed up into that one Pulp Adventures heading. Really kind of useful. What they were doing here was proving that the Rolemaster system was a solid foundation for virtually any genre that you could think of. I think it had already proved that in the past by doing Spacemaster, but this was sort of hammering it home and making that concept of just pushing Rolemaster wherever you wanted it to go, pushing that out as a more sampled concept. But as we discussed in the second edition video, Iron Crown were rapidly running out of time. So by the time all these things came out, it was 1999, but from 1997 on, they were really having problems with finances. The Rolemaster standard system wasn't bringing in as much money. And so they had one last try, or at least in this incarnation, one last try at bringing people over to the Rolemaster game in the form of Rolemaster Fantasy Role-Playing. Now, I don't personally own any of the Rolemaster Fantasy Role-Playing books, but I have read them, and we did use them together with the Rolemaster standard rules. Essentially, they are the same game. Rolemaster Fantasy Role-Playing is repackaged into a sort of more bite-sized, easier to digest form. So what you started with is the Rolemaster Fantasy Role-Playing game book, which was pretty much self-contained. You only needed that to play a form of Rolemaster. And it was better laid out than previous games. It did have that sort of hand-holding movement through the rules as you were learning the rules by creating your character and so on. And then it was expanded out with the additional rulebook. So in this case, even though the Rolemaster Fantasy Role-Playing game line followed suit with all previous editions of Rolemaster by releasing Arms Law first, the Arms Law was, for a start, it was just a recovering of the Rolemaster Standard Rules version. But for a second, the Rolemaster Fantasy Role-Playing book didn't need Arms Law. Arms Law expanded the combat rules from the rules that were presented in Rolemaster Fantasy Role-Playing. So you could start with that one book and then go from there and expand it out in different directions. So you'd learn the game using the Fantasy Role-Playing core rulebook and then make it as complicated as you wanted it to get by expanding out combat by getting Arms Law, expanding out magic by getting spell law, although there wasn't a spell law, not for Rolemaster Fantasy Role-Playing. What you got there, instead of a spell law volume, you had of books. So you had of channeling and of essence and of mentalism. And they would add up to, essentially, spell law. So the final releases for the Rolemaster Fantasy Role-Playing game were, again, essentially recovers, a little bit of tweaking and reformatting and word changes and so on, edits. But essentially, the heart of their material, their recovers of the Treasure Companion and the Channeling Companion. And the School of Hard Knocks, which was the Fantasy Role-Playing core rulebook, also didn't have so extensive a skill selection as Rolemaster Standard Rules, and the School of Hard Knocks provided that expansion. So we're pretty much with those releases, the Rolemaster Fantasy Role-Playing game book with Arms Law, with Of Channeling, with Of Essence, with Of Mentalism, with the School of Hard Knocks. That gave you the core rules that you had in Rolemaster Standard System with Arms Law, the Standard Rules, and Spell Law. With a small amount of additional material coming through in 2000, that was kind of it. So Iron Crown entered Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 1999, and they lost the license to produce Middle-earth books within the September of that year, and I think that was pretty much it. It was trying to, part of the reason for Rolemaster Fantasy Role Playing was we've lost Middle-earth, let's try and repackage Rolemaster, let's try and get it to be our flagship thing, to take up the slack, to sell, to keep the company going, and it didn't. And so in October in 2000, it filed for Chapter 7, and the game was done. But not quite. So by 2001, the ICE trademark and the rights that were swimming around, the rights to things like Rolemaster and so on, the material rights, those that hadn't reverted back to the original authors were picked up by Aurigis Aldebaran through the intervention of one John R. Seal. Now, I'm reading these names off here just in case. And another company, Mjolnir, originally assembled under the name Phoenix. They were put together with some ex-Iron Crown people. And then Aurigis licensed them to continue with the Rolemaster line. And also through to publish things like Space Master. So they continued to publish Rolemaster Fantasy Role Playing. That is the Mjolnir as the company, recovering the core books again in the process, and they also created another sort of spin-off game or subsidiary game called High Action Role Playing, or HARP, which was very much like a simplified version of Rolemaster, and that came out in 2004. I think if you look at HARP, there are sort of echoes of Middle-earth role-playing there as well. So you've got MERP and you've got HARP. MERP was very much a simplification of Rolemaster that was designed to slot into the Tolkien-esque fantasy, and HARP sort of served a similar niche, and almost a continuation of MERP. In 2011, the license to Iron Crown properties shifted from Mjolnir to Guild Companion, and they, from 2012, began working on a new version of Rolemaster. Rolemaster Unified, if that's what it'll end up being called, or RMU is the acronym for it. In the interim, Guild Companion published a revamp of 2nd edition Rolemaster as Rolemaster Classic. See our review on the 2nd edition of Rolemaster, because Rolemaster Classic is pretty much a reformulation of 2nd edition Rolemaster. And in 2017 they officially changed their name to Iron Crown Enterprises. So for the purpose of this video, RMSS or RMFRP, those games effectively ceased active publication in 2011. Now they are available as PDFs and so on Drive-Thru RPG. So the books themselves, most of the books themselves, not all of them, are available as PDFs from Iron Crown via Drive-Thru RPG. So the game is still alive, and is still being actively played by enthusiasts of that particular version of Rolemaster. Just that there's nothing really is being published for it, or the game's not actively being supported other than being sold. A lot of Iron Crown's efforts in that way appear to be going into RMU, and hopefully we may see RMU being released at some point in the near future. Speaking here in February 2021. Play, for the main part, is same as previous editions of Rolemaster, at least in basic terms. The game is still based on 100-sided dice rolls, still makes use of a number of tables to determine results. And just to recap, for those players that have not watched or don't remember from my previous Rolemaster video, the core mechanic of Rolemaster is roll 100-sided dice, add modifiers to this due to skill, circumstance, magic, quality of tools, weapons, raw talent, as in statistics, ability scores, whatever, and opposition, such as a target attempting to dodge or an attack. Then compare the results to a table. For attacks, weaponry, spells, the results provide damage and a critical strike type and severity. For any other maneuvers, the results provide a degree of success or failure and any special effects of the results due. For basic actions, you just go with a simple, if you get more than 100 you've succeeded, or an optional tabulated set of results. That's the very basics of the way that Rolemaster works. In RMSS, that's pretty much the same, except static maneuvers, that is, non-fighty skills, determine success on a table assigned to their skill category. We showed you those briefly earlier, and that gives a more specific detail in the outcomes of a skill. It's not like a generic, like the static action table was in second edition. What you now have is, if you are rolling a stealth static action, then you need to use this particular skill, which will give you different results that are specific to that category. The major differences come from the creation and the development of characters, which we've briefly touched on in the history side. And when I say major differences, then I really do mean major differences. Statistics are generated by point assignment rather than 1d100 rolls. This retains the random element, but also limits the production of super characters from the start. So you get 600 points plus an additional 10d10 points. Those are used to buy statistics. The higher the score, the higher the cost, with scores under 92 being bought on a one-to-one basis. 1 point is one point of score, and then anything over 91 uses a square progression, so of an increasing cost. So, for example, 97 score costs 139 points. The minimum score that must be purchased is 20 in each statistic, and a minimum of 90 must be purchased for the character's primary statistics for their chosen profession. Now that differs from in second edition, where you rolled each of your stats using a 1d100 rolls, discarding anything that was under 20, and then at the end of all of that you could exchange rolls assigned to your profession's primary statistics. You could throw whatever score you rolled there and replace them with 90. In this, there's none of that. You have to specifically assign things, and you have to specifically assign at least 90 to your character's primary statistics. A slight aside here, because it's useful to note the things that RMFRP does that tidies up things from RMSS. So in RMSS, you got the point buy table says, gives you a range of the calculated points for a particular score. So, for example, with a score of 97, like we said, follows that square law. So 97 will cost 139 points. In RMSS, this is given as a range, so you could spend, if you really wanted, 153 points on a score of 97, or 139 points on a score of 97, which I don't know. It's one of those silly things that I seem to put in to rules just to make them look more complicated, and I don't think, for the life of me, I don't know why they do it. But there's examples of things like that in virtually every single book that Iron Crown have ever pushed out. So what RMFRP does to clean that up is it just specifically says this score costs this number of points. So it was at some point it was obviously a recognition that this range of points for a score is a daft thing to put into the game. So let's just tidy it up. So the aside, we'll get through to recommended books and so on later, but Just bear that in mind. The RMSS books in some cases are make unfathomable decisions, whereas the RMFRP books are clearer and tidy up some of the confusion that may be there. Potential stats are generated using a simple dice formula based on the temporary stat score. So the temporary stat scores are the scores that your character currently has and uses, while potential stat scores are those that they can reach during play by developing their stats as they go along. Stat gain rolls that you get at various points in your character's level gaining and development. So this again makes it somewhat easier from the Rolemaster 2nd edition / Rolemaster Classic way of doing things. It also means that you've got that definite flow. Rather than generate all your temporaries and potentials at the start and then assign, what you do is you generate your temporaries and then generate your potentials from there. It makes a little bit more sense. Right, so initial skill purchases are split into 2 phases. You have adolescent and you have apprenticeship. However, the adolescent stage is done by a number of skill ranks being automatically assigned according to your race and culture choice, and then a spend of a certain number of hobby ranks to add a bit of custom flair to that, to those default values. And hobby ranks are also set by race and culture. So, for example, a half-elf automatically gains 2 ranks in alertness, 1 rank in body development, 8 ranks in language, 1 rank in the one-hand-edged weapon category, another rank in a one-handed edged weapon skill, and then a number of other skills, plus in addition 10 hobby ranks to assign as they so choose. Background options are assigned by race and culture, and then we're on to apprenticeship. Now here we are introduced to our old friends, development points, which in RMSS are calculated simply by summing the 5 development stat values. So agility, constitution, memory, reasoning and self-discipline. Add them all together, divide by 5, then you get your development points. So there's no sort of cross-referencing, looking them all up on a table in this. It's just literally the development stats summed together, divided by 5, hey presto. One of the core concepts in Rolemaster is the idea that choice of profession, read as class or whatever you want to do it, determines on how difficult or easy it is for a character to pick up certain skills. So fighters learn fighting skills easier than magic skills, and magicians learn magic skills easier than fighting skills, and so on. This concept is retained in RMSS, but the variable skill cost is also extended to encompass race and culture. So each race and profession provides lists of occupation, everyman and restricted skills. These give characters more or less bang for the buck when they are spending their points on skills. So occupational skills are purchased on a rate of 3 ranks per 1 skill point spent, everyman at a rate of 2 to 1, and restricted at a rate of 1 to 2. This makes race and culture choice much more important to a character concept than was in previous editions of Rolemaster. Of course, skills that don't have any of those classifications are purchased on a 1-to-1 basis. RMSS also introduces the concept of training packages. Now, these are templates of skill ranks and equipment and background additions and a few other odds and sods that are purchased using development points. So you spend a number of development points as indicated for your profession against the training package. So each training package costs a different amount for different professions. The packages give a nice and quick method of spending a bunch of development points in one fell swoop towards a particular character concept. So you might think of an assassin, for example. So the assassin training package, you can buy that for a certain number of development points, and it gives you a whole bunch of skill ranks and other bits and pieces that guide your character towards things that fall within the concept of the assassin. An important thing to note there is the division of skills into categories, which we've already touched on too, providing a similar mechanism. So ranks may be purchased in skill categories, which provide a bonus to all of the skills within the category, as well as individual skills themselves. Now, this is important, as expanding the selection of skills without including some counter in the way that the skills are purchased would force characters into becoming specialised in a very few skills and woefully lacking in a lot of skills. So as we discussed, so with the calculation of development points combined with the ability to buy category ranks, and the accelerated development of occupational and everyman and so on skills in certain areas, the narrow alley choice of useless through over specialization and useless through over generalization are avoided. So moving a step back to cover races, especially when it comes to skills. In previous editions, power points were set by the controlling stat of the character's realm of magic, but now the PowerPoint development skill, which was an option in the original, in second edition, is now a core feature of the game. That means that both the character's hit points and their power points are determined directly through skill development. Now, I mentioned in the second edition Rolemaster Classic video that I personally prefer using that mechanism, so both body development and PowerPoint development being used to determine that aspect of characters, rather than just having one of those determined by skill development and one of those determined by rote, almost on account of your level and specific statistic. So by bringing PowerPoint development into core, I think is a good move. It's kind of what we were doing in second edition anyway. But with the ever-decreasing law of return that covers many aspects of Rolemaster, such as skill rank modifiers, decreasing per skill rank, so the more skill ranks that you have, the less your bonus per skill rank becomes. That is, the first few skill ranks give you a higher bonus than the next block of skill ranks will give you a higher bonus than the next block of skill ranks in summation. So this is now applied to both hit points and power points, and the diminishing return concept is also uses a sort of progression notation. So, for example, the standard progression for determining skill modifiers is noted as -15, 3, 2, 1, 0.5. I'll show you on the screen somewhere how that looks. And that means if you've got no ranks at all in a particular skill, then you take a -15 penalty to it. If you, for every rank from 1 through to 10 ranks, you gain a +3 bonus to it. So at 5 ranks would be +15. And for every rank from 11 to 20, you go to the next one. So 11 to 20 gives you +2 per rank. From 21 to 30, it's +1 per rank. From 31 onwards, it's +0.5 per rank. So you can see how those progressions work. So now these progressions are assigned to both body development and to PowerPoint development in similar ways. So instead of assigning them by dice roll, as in second edition, each rank of body development gave you a hit die roll. Instead of that, you're given a flat score based on the skill progression for body development that you get from your race or culture. And similarly in PowerPoint development, you get a bonus to your PowerPoints according to your race's PowerPoint development skill progression. So, for example, Wood Elf has a body development progress of 0, 6, 3, 1, 1. So no points you get for no body developments, and you get 6 hit points per body development rank from 1 to 10, and 3 hit points per rank from 11 to 20, and so on. And PowerPoint progressions are listed by realm. So there's a separate progression for channeling, for essence, and for mentalism. So we can see that Wood Elves, again, have more of affinity for essence magic. So they have a progression for essence PowerPoint development of 0, 7, 6, 5, 4. And for mentalism, they are not so they're not so in touch with that form of magic, and so their progression there is 06543. So they are better at generating more essence power points than they are at generating mentalism power points. Total power points and hit points for stats and profession choice, as well as the points gained through skills. So total power points and hit points factor in your stats and in your profession choice, as well as in the points that we've discussed using the progression for skill development. So if we take our Wood Elf, for example, and here's some maths for you. So we'll give there a constitution of 90 and a self-discipline of 47, and plonk them into a ranger progression, a ranger profession, sorry. Say the development 3 ranks in body development, she would have a net constitution modifier of +5 for the 90, a net self-discipline of -5 for 47, plus 18 hits due to 3 ranks of body development for 6 hits each, and a +5 body development bonus due to the ranger profession. So the total hits that particular character would have is 38. So that'd be 10 plus 10 minus 5 plus 5 plus 18. All clear? Basically, all of this adds up to more specific detail to the races and the cultures, more differences between them, and which then applies to a greater choice and greater impact of the choices that the players are making when they're choosing the direction they wish their characters to develop. Another area of the rules that has been handily cleaned up is in spell acquisition. So it's not something I touched on in previous videos so much. I'll explain how it works in RM2. So a spellcaster, they would develop skill ranks for a group of related spells, a spell list, and each level they would make a roll using the bonuses that they'd acquired through the spell list development skill. That would apply to a portion of a list according to the type of spellcaster that they were. So if they succeeded in that spell list acquisition roll, then they would gain all the spells in that particular portion. So for example, they would suddenly know, or through the study as represented by the skill development, they would know all of the spells up to 10th level from the spell list that they were focusing on, for example, depending on their profession and whether it's a pure user or a hybrid or whatever. The ranks developed then for the spell list would be completely zeroed, and stuff would start again to build up to a spell list acquisition roll for the next block of spells that their profession was eligible to. For example, it might be the spells from 11 to 20. If those failed, no spells were learned for that particular roll, so the spell list acquisition percentage was kept on hold. So next level, you develop more ranks into it, up the percentage again, try the acquisition roll again and see what you learned there. So it was only zeroed when you achieved a successful thing on it. It just meant that failing a roll made it longer for you to learn a particular list. That's in RM2 days. So in RMSS, it's hugely simplified, and I think fairer. If you consider on a spell list acquisition roll, you could continue to fail that on and on and on and on, depending on how crappy your rolls were as you're going on. So you could end up, theoretically, with a third level magician that didn't know a damn thing. But in RMSS, characters still learn spells by list, so you've still got that spell list acquisition stuff going on, but the skill rank they develop directly correlates to the level of spells that they know from that list. So, for example, if you've got 5 ranks in Bone Lore in the skill to that, you know all of the Bone Lore spells up to level 5. No need to roll, no need to reset skill ranks, no need to swear because you've just failed another spell list acquisition roll. That means your character still can't chuck spells, or you can't actually get the spells you need. It's a direct correlation. You develop the skill in the spell list, you gain knowledge of the spells up to that rank. While other portions of RMSS add a certain level of complexity to the Rolemaster game. This element adds simplicity and, I think, a certain elegance to it. And that's about it from the play angle. I don't really want to go over old ground saying, you know, talking about open-ended roles and this is how you do it and this is how crits work and everything else, because we covered all that in the previous Rolemaster 2 video, and it really is not much different in that regard at all. In fact, it's not different in that regard at all. It's mainly in the character development side of things that RMSS is gives everything the once-over, and in particular the skill system. So that's about it, really. So RMSS gives you more options for your character creation and development. It gives you a little bit of a tweaking in combat, but really not that much. It still provides the rich, detailed type of results that you get through from the percentage combined with the variable critical hit rolls that Arms Law is just used in the same way. Pretty much the same in Magic, other than, as we've just discussed, for the spell list acquisition. And overall, with books like with Games Last Law and Castles and Ruins especially, there's some really nice books within the RMSS and RMFRP line that work for any game. You know, I think there's those two especially, and some of the generic ones they did at the end of the RMSS line, you know, the 10-foot pole and 10 Million Ways to Die. Those two volumes are really good reference works no matter what game you're playing. So most of my Rolemaster experience has been with the second edition of the game. I spent some really enjoyable time in my 20s delving through those companions and messing around and constructing a sort of complex game world, if you like, on top of those rules that I like best. So it really took I really took some inspiration, and I still do take inspiration from the way in which a game can be taken from a core and then with volumes of optional additional rules that can be added on to pretty much change the shape of the game in whatever direction suits the setting or whatever you're trying to achieve can do. When RMSS was published, I obviously found a lot of the ideas that we were exploring through the companions and gluing together. A lot of the sort of hard lifting of trying to shoehorn them into the framework so that they would work properly and balance out properly was already done within RMSS. So it was really nice. You're sitting there with like a whole sled of optional books and various notes that formed the glue between what the companion books and sections of rules and things were saying and which particular options that sometimes there are only about 3 different rules from a particular companion that we used. So copying them over and coming up with a single reference for it was a nightmare. But when RMS came along, it was nice to see that a lot of those concepts that we were using had been built into a single framework. So it lessened down the painful agony of having so many reference books all over the place. But then again, there are some elements of RMSS that I think made things more complicated than they really needed to be. So, for example, while it's nice to think that static maneuvers or static actions or whatever can be nuanced by category, and as such that a particular type of skill is going to produce a different set of effects from another type of skill. Really, using the single static action and the maneuver tables from Rolemaster 2nd edition with a bit of interpretation, I think is a more elegant solution. Those 2 tables with some applied logic and reasoning do a better job, not so much a better job in the outcome, but certainly a better job in terms of reference at the table. You look at the back end of the Rolemaster standard rules, where it prints all the tables. I mean, you've got there are a fair number of them, you know, and all of these are essentially you know, variants on the static action and the moving maneuver table from second edition. So I think that aspect of second edition is more elegant, and there's no reason why you can't actually use them in conjunction with RMSS. The overhaul of character creation itself is hugely welcome and produces more balance than the equivalent of the equivalent from Rolemaster second edition. And when we talk about the equivalent here, we're talking about the full-blown skill selection from the companions, plus the core rules, plus, you know, all of that. I mean, and a number of the additional professions from the companions from second edition were constructed as training packages in RMSS. So, which I think is a more elegant way of doing it, because essentially a lot of those professions were just slightly nuanced versions of classes, you know, or professions. Use classes. Oh, I'm going to be using class. You use class for decades, and then another game comes along and has to call something different, and then you have to try and think in two different directions. But whatever, they're pretty much the same thing. So simplify. So if you take all of the professions from the companions and from second edition companions, all of the skill structures and all of that kind of stuff, that then becomes the equivalent second edition rule set to the Rolemaster standard system, and the way that the Rolemaster standard system makes it all work together, reformulates things, repackages things, I think produces the better game from a character development point of view. For a play point of view, I think if you mix some of the things that are a bit quicker and more elegant from classic / second edition, if you mix them in with some of the better character definitions and skill systems from RMSS, I think you end up with a really good game. Instead of just good games. You know, Rolemaster Second and Classic and RMSS are all good games, but you know, I think they could all do with a bit of spit and polish and updating, which hopefully RMU will do. We'll find out. So the extension of, like I said, especially with the extension of the character creation rules, extension of the background rules, the things like talent law and stuff like that, building it in, giving players much more time, giving players many more tools with which to build the characters that they really want to play, I think is really the gold standard of RMSS here. Not RMFRP, but RMSS is a hell of a lot easier to say. They take them a little bit, sort of, you know, the little bit more faceless, tabulated races and cultures from RM2, and really expand them out, you know, to that full page with descriptions, with a bunch of family life, with the addition of, if you're an elf, then you find these skills a lot easier to pick up than you would otherwise, than someone else, and so on. That balance between between race and culture becoming much more important than it was in RM2, but profession really still meaning something. So the two work hand in hand to provide your development path forward as a character. I think that's really the shining star of the RMSS and RMFRP system. But it still suffers from Iron Crown's strange decisions on how to organise rulebooks. It has you, in just creating a character, it has you flipping backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. which second edition and Rolemaster Classic also do have you flipping around rulebooks all over the flipping place just to create a character. Whereas a lot of role-playing games, I think in fact the norm in role-playing games, as I've found, is the rules handhold you through character generation. This is how I think game rulebooks should be formulated. The first thing that anyone is going to do when they are going to sit down to learn a game is to create a character. Because characters tend to be the hub of all game rules. After all, it's the rules of the game that are going to dictate what and how characters can do anything and players interact with the game situation. So creating characters is the way that people learn, primarily the way that people learn the game. If you have a rule book that says at the start, welcome to the game, I'm going to walk you through playing the game, creating a character with the game, and as we go, as we create each element of your character, I'm going to give you a little bit of an insight into what that means, and then by the end of character generation, you will have a character that's completely playable, and you will understand, if not in detail but in concept, what every element of the character that you've just created means. So, for example, you will understand what skills are. You will understand what the skill bonuses mean and how they work. You may not know the specifics about the results that you would expect from a skill check until such time as you start getting into play and seeing what effect those skill checks have on the gaming environment as you're playing through. You will understand what your combat capabilities are, not necessarily in how best to use them or anything, or every single situational modifier that may be thrown your way, but you'll understand what the bonuses mean and how they are generally used. So all of the core concepts of the game you should have an idea at by the time that you put your pencil down and go, I've created my first character. What Iron Crown seem to want you to do is to either read the rulebooks from cover to cover first, and who the heck does that? I'm sure there are people out there. Let me know, comments, whatever, if you are the sort that when you first buy a game goes and reads the rulebook from cover to cover before you do anything else with it, before you create a character or try and roll on any table or anything like that. Just let me know if you do or not. It'd be interesting. But I don't. The first thing I do is I skim through the character, skim through the rulebook, see how the thing is laid out, and see what chapters are where and which bits of the game are in which part of the book, and then I sit down and create a character. Some companies do this really well. Iron Crown not Iron Crown, Chaosium do it really well. Wizards of the Coast do it really well. Iron Crown, I don't think have ever done it really well. So it's a shame really, because I think that's the one thing that has stood in the way of making Rolemaster a more widely accepted game than it is. A lot of people are frightened of it, and I think why a lot of people are frightened of it is they pick the core rule books up for the game and start trying to create a character, and then realise that after they've flipped to chapter 8 and then back to 3, then off to 11 and then chapter, just have enough of it. Yeah, Iron Crown, sort your book layouts. Like I said, the RMFRP books do a lot better a job of it than the RMSS books. There's still room for improvement, and maybe RMU will be the time that we actually get some well formatted, well thought out progressional rule books for Rolemaster. RMSS has exactly the same kind of pros and cons as second edition Rolemaster. It is the same game essentially, other than all the differences and things that we've covered in the scope of this little overview of it. Again, the name that a lot of people level at it as Table Master is perfectly valid. It's probably even more valid if you take RMSS as a system with all of the lots and lots of maneuver tables and so on, the skill tables. There are more tables in RMSS than there have been in previous editions. So Table Master is a legitimate criticism, but if you don't mind looking up tables and things, then it's you don't notice. I don't think you really notice anyway. It does make a Games Master's referee's job a little bit not as easy as it could have been. But other than that, and I think the way that arms law and spell law, both, the idea of printing the critical sheets on the back of the attack sheets, that really does help. And it follows on the line, as I was saying in the second edition Rolemaster video, it follows on the line of if every player has got all the tables that their character needs for all of their attacks and spells, then things flow a lot better. And once you're used to it, once you're used to what particular roles mean as you're going through, then I don't think it's any more or too far more complex than rolling a 20-sided dice and adding a bunch of modifiers from different tables to it. So your mileage varies. If you hate tables, you're going to hate Rolemaster. If you don't mind tables, then some of the concepts in Rolemaster may really grab you. If you love tables, then Rolemaster is probably the game to you, because I don't think there's any other game that has as many tables as Rolemaster does. Again, like I've been saying recently in these things, is I don't really find scores of things particularly useful. I started putting the scores to things and then realised that all of the games that I'm reviewing, I've played, I love for different reasons. And as soon as you start putting scores onto things, I think there's an element of comparison between one game and another. So like they're saying, oh, this particular game he scored this particular game this, and he scored that particular game that, so therefore he must like that game more than that game, and that's really not what I'm trying to do here. What I'm trying to do is to try and fathom out what I like about these games and what I think can be improved on those games in a sort of brutally honest kind of way, and that's what the scoring started off being. So by saying a 3, that was more like, given that I do like this game, I feel there is a 2 points worth of improvement in this game before we get to what I would consider a 5. And some people have gone, oh, so what would the shape of a 5 game be, or whatever? And the truth of that is, it would be a particular game with some improvements. And in Rolemaster, or Rolemaster standard system, certainly those improvements would be a better layout to the books, would be a less clunky way of dealing with the skill maneuver tables. I think one of the things that you have to consider in a game form such as role-playing that bases itself on narrative, on telling narratives, the mechanics are only there to support the narrative. When things have to be determined in a more objective way, then we let the dice do the talking. We let the skills of the characters actually show what those characters are good at and how they're going to work and so on. What they do, what rules do, and what skills do, and everything else, they take away the arguments like we had when we were kids. If you're playing Cowboys and Indians or whatever, and someone went, bang, you're dead, and then they went, no, I'm not. It's like, big argument. Game fell to pieces. What the rules and the rule frameworks for role-playing games do is is say bang, I'm going to roll to see if you're dead. The dice say that you are dead, so therefore there you go. They take away those arguments and form an objective basis on which those actions can be resolved, and you can see that progression of your character as they get get better at things, or they what sort of areas your character is expert in and what they're weaker in. So that's what rules frameworks do. They support the narrative by preventing arguments from occurring. If you've got rules that hamper the narrative, I think, for example, if a character says, well, I've got this particular skill, this is my bonus in it, and then we've got to hunt down through the pages, because the sheer number of maneuver tables that are there, the skill category tables, means that you either have to have a booklet of them to the side. There's too many of them to be able to put on a handy reference screen in front of you as a referee. Characters could have them with the maneuver tables that they need for the skills that their characters are possessed, but there's probably going to be several of them. All the categories and the skills that they are going to be using are there, and as a referee you've got to have all of those as well. So that to me, any rules in a role-playing game that hamper the ongoing narrative of the play at the table can be better done. And I think that's a lesson for any role-playing game designers out there that like putting complicated rules in that will be used at the table. If you are making people have to sit down and go, oh, hang on a minute, we've got to sort this blooming skill out, and if it breaks the narrative, if it stops play to try and figure something out, then that rule has failed. But I do like the fact, one of the things that's levelled at Rolemaster is it takes a long time to create characters, whatever edition. It takes a long time to create characters, but I think that's one of its strengths. If there's any time that you actually want time to pore over things and go into things and actually come out with something worthwhile and decent, or the complexity, if you like, of working out, it is within character generation. It doesn't interrupt the narrative, and by the time you get to the table, all of that maths and everything else and working out has been done. You've got a character that is rounded, has a decent background, has stuff in it that you've spent time trying to figure out and balance out and work with the way that you perceive your character to be. So you put all that time and effort into it. I mean, it doesn't work if you are the sort of playing group that has a session of, right, everyone, and let's sit down and create our characters together. Because no one's got one single gaming time to spend 3 hours and 3 days on the length of time that it takes to generate a character in Rolemaster. But if you're the kind of group where characters are either pre-gened or they're generated away by the players, sitting down on their own, trying to work out their character concepts, in communication with each other, so you end up with a party that's not just full of magicians or whatever. But I think that's the way that Rolemaster really works. Complexity away from the table, and then throw away those silly maneuver tables. Far too many of them hamper progress of the game far too much. Using the tables, the equivalent tables from second edition, doesn't produce a vastly different amount of set of results. So I think that's the sort of angle I'm coming on. These are the flaws of a game, and I think my rating value, such as it was just kind of highlighting, or an attempt to highlight where games could improve, rather than trying to compare one game to another. So that's pretty much my review of Rolemaster, where we got to. The maneuver tables should be got rid of. The books could be much better organised, and that would make Rolemaster a vastly better game than it is. So RMSS, I think, is a really good addition to the game. It consolidates a lot of ideas from Rolemaster 2nd edition. If you like the core concepts of Rolemaster but prefer simplicity, maybe Rolemaster 2nd Edition, Rolemaster Classic is for you. If you like that additional complexity and the greatly expanded set of skills, then especially if you're a fan of Rolemaster Companion 2, then I'd suggest you go and have a look at Rolemaster Standard System / Rolemaster Fantasy Role Playing, because they do a lot better, a better job at handling that many skills within the framework of the Rolemaster game. So, yeah, there you go. That's my review. Now, much as it is that, like I said previously, I have not got any of the Rolemaster Fantasy Role-Playing books. All of my Rolemaster books from that era are all RMSS vintage. I would urge you to go out, if you were interested in this edition of the game, I would urge you to go for the Rolemaster Fantasy Role-Playing core rulebook as an initial essential. That will get you started. It'll give you everything you need to start playing. Yes, cut down number of skills, cut down number of races, cut down number of professions, that kind of thing. But it'll teach you everything that you need to know about the game, and you can get playing with it. You can pretty much do most things other than create characters with weird races or whatever. But definitely start with that book. Once you get the hang of that, then start getting into the sort of cultures and races book, arms law, and the three core, you know, of mentalism, of channeling, of essence. And you know, the creatures and monsters and the treasure companion, maybe sort of, you know, third or fourth down the way, depends on whether you're a referee or a player, or what you actually want. There's a selection of monsters in the core rulebook, and that will keep you going for a little bit anyway. You'll see how the stats work enough to be able to knock things up on a similar line and modify them prior to picking up creatures and monsters. Another route into Rolemaster is probably the same route that we discussed in getting into Rolemaster Classic, which is picking up Rolemaster Express. Now, Rolemaster Express is a little bit different. So the basic rules, like I said in the basic rule books, the Rolemaster, the Basics box set, Rolemaster Express is even more simplified from them. And again, it's a complete game. But because it's based on Classic, it's a sort of less complicated game than the Rolemaster Fantasy Role-Playing book. So if you started with Rolemaster Express, that would give you a tool to teach you in a relatively simple, non-overwhelming way the core concepts that are common to all Rolemaster games, and then progress, instead of progressing then on to Rolemaster Classic, progress from Express to Rolemaster Fantasy Role-Playing. I know it sounds a bit of an odd way through things because Rolemaster Express is cut down from Classic, but it's still, you know, the underpinning mechanics of Rolemaster haven't changed between Rolemaster 2 and Rolemaster Standard System. It's really in the skills and in the way that characters are constructed. They're where the really huge differences are, and I think Rolemaster Express gives you that, you know, that simple in to learn those base mechanics, and then go for Rolemaster Fantasy Role-Playing for the RMSS, whatever experience, you know, the sort of grown-up version of it, or whatever you want to call it. Another thing you might want to consider, instead of going down the route of buying the of channeling, of mentalism and whatever, is after you've got the Rolemaster Fantasy Role-Playing book, picking up the RMSS versions of Spell Law. Then, you know, it's the same game, so all of those books are compatible with each other, so it doesn't matter which versions you pick up. And with Spell Law, you then get pretty much all of the stuff of channeling, of mentalism, and of essence in that one volume, so you won't have lots of different books to play around with there. Definitely pick up Games Master Lore if you are going to be a Games Master or a referee, whatever you want to call it. Games Master Lore is an essential book, and I think any role-playing game Games Master, especially in the fantasy genre, could do well with that book on their library. And just as a sort of note on some of the books, things like the Treasure Companion and Creatures and Monsters, and these books, it doesn't matter whether you buy the RMSS versions or the RMFRP versions of those, because they are essentially the same book. All they've been doing is retitled or rejigged for the particular edition that they're released for, but there's no difference whatsoever. Maybe a few typos have been cleaned up. I don't know. I haven't sat down and checked, but it doesn't matter which versions of those games that you pick up if you're playing with RMSS or RMFRP. So, as always with Iron Crown, the RMSS and RMFRP books are highly detailed, and they present a complex game with detail and depth. The system is an improvement, I think, over its previous edition on the whole, and the number of tools that are presented to you both as a player and a referee are, they're just really breathtaking. And I think a number of games could learn from the amount of detail that you can put into campaign design, scenario design, and character design through Rolemaster, through the actual meat of the books, and also the system. It adds some unnecessary complexity that we've discussed. I'm not going to bang on at that again, but it also provides some much needed simplification over its antecedents, and balances a lot of the concepts that were introduced during the run of second edition, but then ultimately ended up breaking the game. All in all, it's a solid game. My advice would be that if you like detail in the system but not too much, then go for the second edition or the classic. But if you really like fine-tuning and honing, then the Rolemaster Standard System, Rolemaster Fantasy Role-Playing, remember, same game, different name, then it could well be your cup of tea. It certainly has brought me quite a lot of joy. Like I said, most of my Rolemaster experience has been with second edition, but the amount of things that I've extracted and taken away from Rolemaster Standard System into other games that I've played, other game systems, and also in playing RMSS in a game in its own right, I think it's been an absolute worthwhile experience. I have got a lot of joy out of meddling around with this. Disorganised as it is, in my opinion, it is still under the surface of it a fantastic game. And that's it. Rolemaster Standard System, or, if you will, Rolemaster Fantasy Role-Playing.